Good morning, everyone, once again, to all of those here in the room today, as well as everyone online. I'm Associate Professor Sarah Kelly. I'm in the UQ Business School, and I'm one of the co-leaders of the Trust, Ethics and Governance Alliance, which is about the summit today. And, firstly, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of Myanmar, where we are meeting today, the Yagara and Turrbal peoples. I'd like to acknowledge their elders past and present, and of course their emerging leaders, as we walk with them in reconciliation as a nation. So firstly, thank you so much everyone for turning up today. Despite the weather, I hear the traffic is horrendous. We really appreciate the time that you're devoting to this important summit. It's obviously these topics of trust, ethics and governance aren't only critical from our point of view as researchers in this space, and interdisciplinary researchers at that, from law, psychology, management, business, governance, but also externally. So it's really great to have some of our industry partners here today and online, here supporting this important research and evidence-based outcomes for practice. So just very quickly, a little bit about the Trust, Ethics and Governance Alliance. We're a UQ-based interdisciplinary research group, but saying that, we're actually global. So we work and collaborate with industry, government, not-for-profits and communities around the world, and other universities and institutions concerned in this space. Obviously a really important space, an increasingly important space, as we'll see from some of the fantastic topics that our panels and presenters, researchers will be talking about today. Topics like, operating and managing crisis in a VUCA world, transforming governance. I had to speak at an event recently of the AICD about managing crisis and mitigating corporate scandals. And when you do scratch the surface there, the breaking of ethical-based and trust-based scandals across all sectors seems to be happening more frequently and, of course, augmented across the media. So much to unpack and discuss along those lines as well. Emerging tech and what this means for trust and ethics. Of course, a really important space when we see this Goliath of AI permeating every corner of how we operate in every sector. And a fantastic keynote, which we're all very much, a virtual keynote, which we're very much looking forward to from David de Kremer on trusting intelligent technologies in the workplace of the future. So in terms of the Trust, Ethics and Governance Alliance, I should sort of give you a couple of high-level examples of some of the terrific research and, most importantly, impactful research that we are generating as a group. One that many of you will have already read about is AI research, is Australia's AI Action Plan, where it has been published about this is trust in AI, led by one of the co-leaders of the Trust, Ethics and Governance Alliance, Professor Nicole Gillespie, who's also the Chair of Trust in the KPMG Chair of Trust in the UQ Business School. This has also been published as part of the Human Rights Technology Report, so and they're just some of the impacts of that report. We've also been working with the Australian Law Reform Commission, looking at corporate culture and some of the increasing soft and hard regulations coming in around directors' liabilities, both criminal and civil, in overseeing and mitigating against unethical cultures and overseeing ethical cultures, how to measure it and how to build it. So a really interesting program ahead. I do encourage all of you to network, relax, enjoy, and hopefully learn and engage in the discussion through Q&A. We do have dedicated monitoring for those online of the chat, so please feel free to use that. We have one of our leaders of the Trust, Ethics and Governance Alliance, Dr. Shannon Colville, involved in leading the responses to the chat. She's very busy down the back there, I can see. So thanks, Shannon. So we do want it to be an engaging session all day. Many of you are busy, I know, so feel free to drop in and drop out if you have to duck out to a meeting and come back. We'd still like to see you. And again, many thanks for joining us. So as it turns out, I am also the moderator for the first panel session on managing crisis in a VUCA world, because one of our other leaders from the law school at UQ, Dr. Rada Ivory, who has done a tremendous amount of preparation for this session, actually has COVID. And Rada, if you're online, hello. I hope I do you justice as the moderator stepping in here. So I'd like to introduce our panel. It's an absolutely fantastic panel, a combination of a couple of our research experts in this area, as well as a couple of people who have some of, in my view, some of the best practical experience in managing this VUCA, particularly in recent times. You'll see their bios in the program, their extended bios, so I won't waste time, and I probably can't do them justice anyway in that time, reading all of those out, but please refer and you'll see why they're so esteemed, and we're lucky to have them here today. First of all, I'd like to introduce Jacqueline Wooten from Herbert Smith Freehills. Jackie, would you like to come up to the stage? So we always need a lawyer in the room, I think, when there's some sort of a crisis unfolding, and certainly in planning, which I think we'll hear a bit about today, on how to handle a crisis when it does unfold. Jackie is a partner at Herbert Smith Freehills, as I've said. We also have Chris Mills, from the CEO of Queensland Airports Limited. So you can only imagine what Chris has been through over the past couple of years, and even before that, just managing significant infrastructure like that is extraordinary as a leader, I imagine. Chris is also on the board of Tourism and Events Queensland, and so I know he's had a lot of experience there in managing what has been a very disruptive world for tourism in this state and nation. And then we have some of our own experts. We have Associate Professor Gabby Walters from the UQ Business School, specialising in tourism in particular and managing crisis in that sector. So Gabby, we're really grateful to have you here today. And as well, Dr. Richard O'Quinn, who is also from the UQ Business School, and an extraordinary from the echelons of the American military in his past. He then, finished up there, retired after more than 20 years of service. He's very well regarded over there. I understand the Pentagon greets you, Richard, when you go and visit, as a leader around anti-terrorism in particular. But he then did an MBA at UQ Business School and then a PhD specialising in strategic leadership and ethical leadership. So Richard, it's great we've got you on this panel as well. So we might get started with a few, questions. It's a big topic, obviously, and we've got a limited amount of time. But, some of the key questions I think that come to mind when you see this topic might be things like, what drives ethical leadership in times of crisis? Is it something you let go of with this rapid decision-making under ambiguous conditions that we're expected to do? What are some of the unintended consequences of decisions and making policy in times of crisis when often there's a short-term rather than a long-term view being deployed? Why is corporate governance and purpose important in uncertain times? And how can we learn from the past and current crises so we can manage better in the future? So we might, Chris, start with you, if that's okay, on this topic. So looking at the place crisis management plays in a VUCA world, can you give us some of the examples of this volatility, the uncertainty that you've had to deal with, how you've dealt with it, particularly with stakeholders, and both in the infrastructure and airports, aviation industry and tourism?
Yes, thank you, and thanks for having me, Sarah, and thanks everyone. Look, we manage a group of 4 airports. Gold Coast Airport is the largest in our group, and as an airport which prior to the pandemic is very dependent on international and interstate tourism, obviously closed borders are not what we were looking for. In April 2020 we had a total of 1,500 passengers go through the airport in the whole month. To put that in context, in April this year, we had 555,000 passengers go through in the month. So we dropped down to 1,500 passengers in 1 month, which is what we would do in probably an hour normally. I guess it's always been important to us to recognise that crisis management and crisis preparation is fundamental to what we do. So as an airport at the Gold Coast, where we straddle the state borders as well, we have a lot of stakeholders. So we've got the federal police are located on the airport, but we deal with the Queensland Police, New South Wales Police, the fireys, the ambulance. We have airport fireys as well as the locals. So we've always understood the importance of good crisis management and preparation, but typically what that means is full-blown simulations, bringing in all the stakeholders, everyone understanding their role, and normally scenarios that involve terrorism, crashes, other incidents. Our pandemic preparation in terms of crisis management was, to be honest about it, a couple of lines in our crisis management manuals. So it would be fair to say that it was something very new and very different for us from all of the scenarios. Having said that, because we spend a lot of time prepping and understanding the roles and standing up crisis committees, how we engage with our board, how we engage with external stakeholders, I guess the key thing for us as well was being flexible and agile. And I think that's always important when you're dealing with a crisis, clearly. You're never going to have something scripted that you can just follow and say, this is how it should work. So, but we had to really move things around quite differently. We moved most people, as occurred everywhere, most people worked from home, but we had to make some decisions very quickly about workforce, knowing that the borders would be shut for an unknown period of time. We were well placed from an IT perspective to operate remotely. We still had to have people on site to deal with the one plane every 2 days that was coming in with 15 people on it. But we had to make decisions about workforce. We had to make decisions about projects. We, in fact, next month we'll have practical completion on a terminal expansion on the Gold Coast, which doubles the footprint. But at that point in time, 2 years ago, we had to make a decision about, do we mothball what we've done? Do we keep going? I think good governance around that was important, and we went from having a board meeting every 2 months to having a board meeting every week. We went from having executive meetings once a week to daily, and then 3 times a week as we moved on. We had to make a lot of decisions very quickly, and we had to make sure that we had the best information possible as well. So when you're working remotely, gathering that information in order to make decisions, that put some pressures on, but it was amazing how quickly we adapted, and I think that ability to be nimble, agile and flexible was really critical through that. So in terms of managing those stakeholders, I think the governments, the federal and state governments, like most of us, were not sure what to do either. That required a lot of interaction with the governments. I can recall getting phone calls from ministers saying, are you going to turn planes away from New South Wales when they come in? And I said, well, no, I'm not. That needs to be something broader. So these are before health orders were put in place and other decisions were made. So a lot of things had to happen very quickly. In some cases we had to help lead the conversation, and in other cases we had to respond. But I think, as I say, the key takeouts there, apart from preparation for crisis, is being able to be flexible and responsive, and communications. That was a central theme that came from our employees when we did surveys subsequently. What could we do better? What could we do more of? But also with our external stakeholders, I think the importance of regular communication. There was a point where we were having weekly meetings with the tourism industry, with the tourism minister, the director general and others, bringing in the chief health officer and so on. So probably spoken enough there for now, Sarah, but it's a bit of a flavour.
Incredible. We'll come back to more on this, Chris, but extraordinary lived experience in one of the biggest crises we've faced, really, as a state and as a nation. And my observation in having worked closely with you and seen you through this period is definitely your equanimity. You're just so calm, and that's maybe an aspect of ethical leadership that hasn't been mentioned in what you've just said, and you wouldn't do that because you are the humilities there, but I've noticed that about you. You're under extreme pressure. It was, and some of the staff who you really valued and had a lot of trust with, you had to let go of all these decisions you're making. So, I thought that was a learning for me in observing you, that the calmness you showed throughout the time, and still do.
Thank you.
So thanks for starting out with that incredible experience to really frame our discussion today. Richard, can we just turn to you next around the concept of ethical leadership in crisis? Does it exist, or do we let go of it to trade off more pragmatic objectives? Is it possible to achieve both? What are your thoughts around this?
Yeah, so thanks for having me, Sarah, and always a ingratiating or a very big introduction that you give on my behalf. So I think I'll speak from my own personal experience in my military time and some of the challenges that I faced. Ethical leadership, I think, is important at the individual core level, but it also resonates across organizations, and it's absolutely critical that individuals and organizations determine ahead of crises what they think is ethical for their organization and what red lines they're not willing to cross. So no matter what the situation, there's a level of understanding of what will be achieved and what won't be done as an organization and as individuals. And as Chris was just talking about, questions coming down from other folks, turning planes away, et cetera. In my experience, the decision elevator, as I've nicknamed it at times, seems to drop quite quickly from folks who don't want to necessarily handle a decision at their level and are looking for input from much lower. And if organizations and leaders of organizations don't take responsibility at the right level for the ethics of their organization, for what means most to them as an organization, they'll find that decision elevator drops quickly, and where it lands is anybody's guess. And so then the people who are making decisions on behalf of the organization, when it comes to ethics, can be much lower than the senior leadership. And that is, I think, an area that most organizations don't want to go down, or a situation that they don't want to have happen. So you can be pragmatic and ethical at the same time. In fact, if you're not considering ethical aspects of every decision you make, you'll find yourself not being able to achieve those pragmatic decisions, those pragmatic situations. So absolutely critical, regardless of circumstance, maintaining that ethical core.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's interesting, isn't it? So when you were saying that, it's often the people at the bottom making some of these key ethical decisions as well. And I know, you would know more than me, but the weight of the research points to the need for harmony in these decisions between the top and the bottom. And if either are off kilter, then we're in trouble even in crisis. So that's a really important point. Thanks, Richard. I think, Jackie, we might turn to you. You've got incredible experience, obviously, navigating regulation and corporate culture, governance as well. What's your advice, and drawing on some of the experience and stories you have, I think, in dealing with the Ukraine as well, and people-centred approaches to governance. What's your advice there? Is there, how do we ensure there's flexibility, as Chris has already discussed as well, in how we manage the governance in these times?
Yeah, thank you. It's big questions, aren't they? I guess, just sort of reflecting on some of these things, there are a few examples that I just wanted to share, I guess, of how I've seen good governance and values really help drive decisions in times of crisis or uncertainty. One of them picks up again on, I guess, Chris, your experience around the pandemic, and is one, I guess, that we saw in our own business. We're a global firm. We were operating in many, many different countries, which were all in different states of flux, varying states of restrictions and lockdowns. And so again, sort of how as a business do you manage a workforce through that sort of time of extreme, unprecedented change? I have to say we didn't have the benefit of sort of having pre-planned a scenario and practiced this. We were very much, I think, as a business, like many organisations, dealing with this, as things evolved and changed. And one of the things that I look back on and think that the leadership in our firm did really well is sort of hold to a few core principles. And one of them was to say, this is all about people. We're a people business. The heart of everything that we do and the heart of our decision making through this time of change really needs to be driven and guided by people. So the word empathy was used a lot. It was certainly something that we as leaders of our teams were encouraged to have front of mind as we were trying to navigate through. We obviously were working not only with our teams but also really closely with our clients, and always just trying to put ourselves in the shoes of the people on the other side of what was a Teams call or a Skype meeting or a Zoom call, just really trying to bring that empathy and that sense of understanding of their situation and how that might inform how we as a business were going about what we were doing and how we were responding to change. That certainly, for me, I think that was part of ethical leadership, just really having some values which drive what we do. One of the things that it led us to do was to not just to say how in all of this can we put people first, what's really important to our people in this time of change, and how do we try and help give a sense of certainty in a period of significant uncertainty. And one of the things that I'm really proud to say that we were able to do is to say, well, we need to do more than just be reactive to change. We'll need to do that. There will be things that flux and change. But as a business, one of the things that we decided to do quite early was to say, we need to recognise that our way of working has significantly altered, and how do we actually embrace that and put some certainty around that, rather than just sort of seeing this as a time where people don't quite know how they will work for years ahead. And so very early in the response to the pandemic, we announced sort of a new way of working, sort of embedding in some of the agility that we were all having to adapt to. But rather than saying, well, that's just going to be a response to what's happening, we said, this is the way we will do things going forward. I know I've got some of our team here, so I hope you also saw that as being a positive that we did. But for me, again, that was, how do businesses respond to these difficult times? And I think sometimes trying to take ownership of challenge and say, how do we actually drive this and use this to proactively change what we're doing? I certainly look back on that period, the last couple of years, and think that's something I'm really proud of in terms of our response. But perhaps if I can just, I know we don't want to make this all about the pandemic, and I think your question was probably broader than where I've already gone. But the other thing that I've certainly seen in my work with corporates is just the importance of good governance and good corporate values in driving how organisations deal with issues of scandal or crisis. There's a whole range of things that can bring those situations about, including sometimes adverse publicity in a newspaper, potentially a regulator asking lots of questions and really challenging an organisation's sense of themselves. And in those sort of situations, as I see corporates navigate those times, you definitely see organisations leaning towards one or other end of a spectrum. There can be sometimes a sense of wanting to deny or minimise or just ignore, push to one side what's going on. That's one way of dealing with it. I've never seen that go well. But organisations that I think come through those periods of change and challenge in a much more stronger and robust way, it always comes down to really strong leadership and recognising that there are moments when the board needs to step up. Chris, you mentioned just that increasing frequency of leadership coming together and really being at the helm, so critical. Really, Chris, you mentioned stakeholders. Again, I think organisations that recognise that those periods of change need they need to be thinking about and mapping out and thinking about how this will impact a really broad stakeholder group. That's a critical part of that response as well. The other thing that I've seen is a real differentiator is organisations that will accept that, okay, this has happened, how do we move beyond this? How do we recognise that we may need to change? There may be areas where we need to recognise we've got to do better and improve. Again, sort of having that as part of the way in which an organisation responds, I think I've certainly seen that's been a really key differentiator and a key aspect of an organisation being set up well to come through and to be stronger after a period of great change. So hopefully there's a few things in there, Sarah.
Thank you. No, I'm listening intently there. I wished I brought my notes to take, and I can see people taking notes out. It's really interesting experience to get that from a global professional services operation in the law as well, where everyone does come for advice in crisis planning and crisis, to hear that perspective where you see across sectors like that. So thank you very much for that. I think too, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I think this year is the 20th anniversary of Enron. I was just thinking, Richard, thinking about what you said too, and you too, Jackie, on it's not so much, having a crisis is not, it's not if but when for most organisations, and we absolutely do have to scenario test it and plan ahead, but it's how you respond to it, particularly the leadership. So that's a really important point. I think Enron's a great case study there on how it was done so poorly. Not only the fact of what occurred around dodgy accounting practices and overblown incentives and all the rest, but it was also how they responded. And one example was, I think the CEO met with shareholders in the wake of a couple of the negative market responses, the share price falling, for instance, where it hadn't all broken, part of it had broken, and the CEO said in the announcement in that meeting when they were complaining, don't worry, the share price will increase, we're about to do a whole lot of made a whole lot of false promises, in other words, knowing that scandal was going to get a whole lot worse. So there's an example of an unethical response, I suppose, but it's often just, and we know from the research, I think, apologising quickly from the right source, that the figurehead of the organisation is always the best approach. Gabby, can we hear from you? I would like to know, and I know we've talked a lot about this in the past, but the unintended consequences of decision-making in the best of times are something that is not discussed enough. But what about in crisis? We're making these rapid decisions under pressure and ambiguity, as we know. Are we thinking about those unintended consequences, or just the ones immediately in front of us and serving that particular group that is immediately in front of us? Can we talk to that? I know you've done a lot of research on this.
So, thanks, Sarah, and it's great to be here. I love these summits because they always make me think really hard about my work and what it means in terms of trust, ethics and governance. So, unintended consequences, it's important to realise or think about the fact that there are both those that we can anticipate and those that are not unanticipated. And in an ideal world, most of our unintended consequences are anticipated because that enables us to plan, right? We can say, okay, if this happens or if this goes wrong, we have a songbook and we know how to respond to that. Unfortunately, with this pandemic, this rotten, terrible pandemic over the last 2.5 years, we haven't had that songbook, we haven't had that particular crisis plan to go to. We had a couple of lines in Chris's crisis plan that he mentioned, but we weren't in a position to model, to plan for, to respond to the unintended consequences that came our way. And from a tourism perspective, I think that you'd agree with me that the sector has copped it from all angles, and there are some consequences that are probably more evident than others. But what's really important is the role that the government played in this. And that is, I did 2 studies over the last 2 years looking at consumer sentiment. So my focus is really on the consumer side of things, not so much the governance and organisational side of things. But they were really trusting the government. So whatever the government was saying or putting in place, they were going with it. And for tourism, that meant if the government said it's not safe to travel, not so much don't travel, they wouldn't travel. So the cruise sector is a great example of this. Now, we had a ban on the cruise sector for nearly 2 years, a little bit over. They've just opened up now. That industry, and Sarah and I have done a project on this, that industry is having to diversify its entire market because the people who used to cruise and were used to cruising will no longer cruise because of the fear of cruising, and also the government banning cruising, even domestic cruising has sent a significant message to the market around the safety and risks associated with this form of travel. So we've seen this, that's a $68 billion industry worldwide, and the industry, as a result, are going to have a long road back to recovery. It's not just about domestic travel as well. We've been very used to domestic travel, but my study last year, 50% of Australians said, no, I'm not going overseas. That is, Australians are very used to travelling overseas. We are big travellers, but they're just, I'm not quite ready yet. And that's for domestic tourism operators. They might say, great, we're going to have more visitors to our regions, but this also works both ways. It's not just within Australia that people are more reluctant to travel overseas, it's globally. So it means our inbound tourist industry will be impacted as well. We have seen fantastic, if I can say, there's a positive consequence out of this, fantastic growth in our regions. So in our regional tourism destinations, that's because we were trapped. We couldn't go anywhere else, so we took that road trip, we went off the beaten track, we visited those regional destinations, which has been great for the industry and great for tourist dispersal. So, but the downside of that is people have fallen in love with our regional and our coastal destinations and bought real estate there. And then what happens is these people think, well, I can work from home and I want to live in one of the most beautiful places in Australia, so I'm going to move to Caloundra, or I'm going to buy a holiday unit because I don't need to spend my money going overseas, so I'll keep my holiday unit and use it, 3-4 times a year. What happens is the people who need to work in those beautiful regional destinations and service the tourism industry have nowhere to live. So in a way, we see a demise in these destinations because they don't have the labour force in order to service a really lucrative, viable tourism industry. So it's twists and turns, and nobody knew this would happen, and nobody would thought that far ahead. And we've got a lot of this to cope with, and our rush back to travel. So I listened to so many people, industry academics saying, yes, when we come back, we're going to come back slowly, more sustainably. Tourism going to look so different. And then the government has said, all right, go forth and travel, and bang. Did anyone travel over Easter? Yes, so travelling was difficult. I'm sorry, Chris, but it was difficult, and the industry are not ready. We are not in a post-COVID era. We are still in a COVID era. And I flew back on I flew back on an airline from Sydney.
Sounded like Qantas.
No, it was, you would never have heard of it.
Gabby's just been on a honeymoon, so
it was.
Just filling everyone in there.
The poor cabin crew, they were out of food. And I was sitting a row back from business class, not in business class, but they said, we're so sorry, due to a resource shortage, here's a bag of pretzels. And I was fine, but it's just the staff and the people, the frontline people who are being impacted by this. And it's just about, now we have a little bit of time, a little bit of leeway to plan, to think about those consequences and plan better and think about, well, if X, what happens to Y? If every second person in Australia decides to jump on a plane all of a sudden because they can, what will happen? Do we have the resources? And yeah, that's sort of think where we need to head.
Thanks, Gabby. No, tremendous insight and some really practical lived examples there as well that really bring to light your research on that. But yeah, no, the unintended consequences are extraordinary. I know I've worked in the sports sector and as an administrator, and yeah, some of the decision making during the pandemic and the floods actually has been extraordinary. and I don't think we can judge some of the decision makers there, but certainly some of the products of sport, like women's sport, less resource sports, have been more adversely impacted by some of this decision making around their competitions and national competitions due to budgetary constraints, infrastructure constraints in the wake of the floods. They won't play there, they'll play down the coast midweek at 6 o'clock at night. So we know, Chris, from the highway, getting down the highway there, you have to leave Brisbane by about 2:30 p.m. or earlier when you have a warm-up and physio and all the things elite players need. But women's sport, the bit they forgot is they all work full-time as well as playing professionally. So to get time off work is impossible for them at short notice, because these decisions were made maybe on the Monday that they were playing on the Wednesday night due to the... And so unintended consequences, I've seen it firsthand as well. And I think I'm just conscious of the time too, and we want a bit of Q&A, but just to ask all of you, can you reflect on maybe one key learning that you feel has come out of crisis management in a VUCA world from what we've seen recently, or in your experience, but particularly I think recently, when who would have thought 6 months ago we'd be reading about pandemic, floods, and a potential for a world war? It's unbelievable, and more. I mean, we've always got the climate change and the AI as well, disruption happening, digital disruption in the background anyway. So can we get your quick take on that? Richard, can we start with you?
Yeah, sure. So my previous job, I spent pretty much my whole career worrying about volatile, uncertain situations. And so we had systematic ways of dealing with that, of thinking about it, of planning for it, and preparing for it. And I think going with what Gabby said about unintended consequences, I would say one key thing that we always had to ask ourselves are what are the second and third order effects of the decisions that we were making. So second and third order, meaning beyond just the effects of the specific decision. Who else is affected? Who else needs to know about this decision? What do they need to know about it? And that was very important. But really, I think Chris has talked about it. I think Jackie's talked about it. Preparing and rehearsing for these scenarios is absolutely critical, and something that we spent an inordinate amount of time in my last job doing. So thinking about your plans, reviewing your plans and policies, because there's not going to be an end to change. It is going to continue happening, right? If you think back over the last 10 years, there's probably been a significant event every single year that's caused people and organizations to think about their own livelihood, their own existence, and their own operations. So if you can build into your day-to-day routines after action reviews, what did we expect to happen in this situation? What actually happened in this situation? What can we sustain? Maybe 3 things we can keep doing that are good about what we're doing in regard to a current volatile situation. And what are some things that we need to change? What are 3 things that we could improve? But the most critical part of after action reviews is not just that reflection, that deliberate, systematic reflection, but then enabling it, so putting it into practice. So the next step is critical. Lessons aren't really fully learned until you've put them into day-to-day operations. So consider how you go about that. Exercise, rehearse, and do it in physical realm, not just in your mental realm or in discussions. When you actually get out and start moving around and having to maybe test a logistics network from one location to the other, like driving or trains or planes or whatever, you start seeing new things that you don't see when it's a mental drill. So absolutely, I would say, enact it in real life, make those changes, and review, and keep reviewing. Yep.
Thanks, Richard. Very excellent insights there, and I know from both of your careers. Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, Sarah, look, there are a lot of learnings, but if I just I was trying to sort of distill that into one thing, it's changed the way we work. And I know it's not just for our business, but many businesses out there. But and that's positive and negative. So just picking out a couple of aspects to that. One, and as Gabby was saying, with tourism and aviation, the industry is damaged. When I had to reduce my workforce by 1/3. The rest of us who stayed had to take a 20% pay cut. And they're pretty fundamental things. So very hard, I talked to the airline CEOs as well, very hard to get people back into an industry where for 2 years you've essentially been punished for being in tourism and aviation. And a lot of people have fled to different industries. So I think that's certainly a challenge. But in terms of the way we work, the technology and the ability to work from home has been proven. That's good, again, but also a challenge in getting people back into the workforce, back into the office, I mean. So even though we're very busy, I think everyone's different. I prefer to be around people. I get my energy from that. Others very happy to sort of be in a situation now where working from home 2 or 3 days a week should be the norm. And that doesn't work for every job. There's certainly jobs at the airport which can't be done remotely, and that starts to create some tensions as there are perceptions around employees being treated very differently. And my final point in terms of key learnings around changing the way we work, you don't waste a crisis. I think we know our business better than we did before we went into the crisis. So we had to work out how to get information to make decisions and access information that we never needed or perhaps were focused on the day-to-day and realised that we could sharpen what we got so that we could have real-time information to inform our decision-making, which has made things more efficient. So a mix of positives and negatives there.
Thanks, Chris. And that actually ties into one of our panel sessions this afternoon, Nicole. So in a post-truth world, how we're navigating there. So thank you for mentioning that. Gabby?
I think I would conclude by saying let's do our best to transition those unanticipated consequences into anticipated consequences. And that's not saying they're not allowed to happen, it's saying how can we better plan for them to happen. And I feel like some of the decision making around the tourism industry, and I think this pandemic generally, to me a lot of those decisions seem to be made in a vault. And I think we've missed an opportunity there. There are so many people with such great expertise that I think was not recognised or not utilised during this pandemic. And I think it's time to sort of realise who are the go-to people, who are the people that can help inform this decision, and who are the people who understand the potential consequences of this decision. And as academics, we're often banging our head against the wall because we've written a paper on that, we've conducted a study on that, and we're watching this fallout in front of us, on the news. And I think there are so much knowledge out there that is just not utilised to improve how we make these decisions.
Mm-hmm. It's a good point, isn't it? And not only around tourism sector, but I think even the health sector and the example of vaccinations and health management in crisis, a lot of the scientists and doctors were just not listened to across the world. And I think that'll be a key learning out of that sometimes science evidence is absolutely the way to make decisions in crisis, absolutely, which we've heard today. Jackie, you get the final word, although there will be Q&A.
This is, great honour. I guess as I sort of listen to these fabulous insights, for me, I think I come back to sort of one key learning, quite a personal learning. What am I going to do the next time that there's a moment of crisis, of change, uncertainty? How will I face into decisions? How will I sort of talk and encourage my clients to be thinking about those situations? And I think it's recognising in that moment, hopefully you planned for it, but if you haven't, and it hasn't been something that you've rehearsed and you've got a game plan that you can turn to, I guess just that pause to recognise, let's try and see this from as many perspectives as possible, to draw in those different perspectives that I might not bring to that situation, and then with the best of intent, make the best decision possible in that moment. I think that's for me, I think kind of where I come away from hearing a lot of this. There's so much good that we can be doing in advance, but at the end of the day, in that moment, I guess let's try and think about it from as many perspectives as possible and make the best decision moving forward.
More good advice and insights. That idea of zooming out, even in crisis, to get an aerial view of I think that's really, really good advice. Thank you. Tremendous insights from the panel. So I'd like to throw it to you guys. Do we have any questions online as well, Shannon, if there's any key themes in the chat or coming through? But does anyone have any questions for our panel? Don't be shy. That's what today's about.
We do have...
Someone at the back. Can you say your name as well so we know?
My name is Alex McDade. I do have a question online from the online chat. This is from Sarah. She said, do the panellists have any comments on leadership, including unintended consequences regarding events like the Ukraine conflict?
Who would like to take this one? Would that be you, Richard, maybe?
You give me the easy one, hey? So there's so many questions in that single question there. How much of it is intended or unintended? I think, if I take it from the rest of the world perspective, so Australia, Ukraine, NATO alliance, and other folks who are trying to help the situation rather than cause problems in the situation. I think, from a trust and ethics perspective, it's quite clear that aggression is not a good situation in any circumstance. When organizations decide to get involved in what really is a challenging situation there, they need to be clear about what they're willing to do or not do to help people. There's been a lot of leadership at the individual level in places like Poland, in neighboring countries, where individual citizens have parked prams in train stations to help people who are fleeing the situation, to take care of them. People handing out food, people giving homes or rooms to people in the situation. So while maybe many of us look from our perspective at what senior leaders are doing in those situations, I think it's really important to think about what individuals at, not even organizational leaders, but individuals in the community, what they can do from a leadership perspective, and what they can do that's ethical, that's moral, and the right thing to do. And they can take action. They can think about unintended consequences of their actions, but they can think about what they absolutely intend to do, and that's help folks in those situations. And I think that's a great example of demonstrated leadership in, across communities at the lowest level, without direction, without guidance, but with a good outcome. So that's where I'm focused, and I'm hopeful that this will get resolved.
Thanks for that. Did anyone want to add to that around perhaps a business perspective and examining supply chain, and especially under international sanctions vis-a-vis Russia? I mean, how has that affected business or clients, Jackie or Chris?
Yeah, certainly. There's no doubt supply chain seems to be a phrase that is used more and more often these days. You've got the impacts of the pandemic, but the overlay with the Ukraine, and it's amazing how much, when you drill down into it, from our perspective, how much on a project is sourced from overseas. And so we've had aero bridges built in China, we've had furniture coming from Canada, and we've had other products in Europe, and the Ukraine-Russia conflict has seen impacts on our projects in terms of supply. But I think, and just picking up on some of Richard's comments as well, the importance, and what we certainly recognise from our perspective as airports is that community perspective, and it feels like we're a long way away, but we know members of the community who are affected, and I think certainly we see it as our role in any event, and I'll pick Townsville 2019 flood impact, that's another one of our airports, but even just more recently the northern New South Wales floods, communities devastated by events, and it is up to the corporates, the citizens, the corporate citizens, even in times when we've had it very difficult to play a role, because our employees live in those communities, people travel through the airports from those communities, but we all know someone who's been impacted. So whether you're taking it as a global event or a local event, I think that's a reminder that corporates have a role to play as well as government in terms of looking out for the welfare of the community.
Thanks. Yeah, just another perspective. And Jackie, did you want to add to that, or we go to another question?
I guess just a very brief comment, and then I'm sure there are other questions that we want to have a discussion around. I guess it's a good reminder, isn't it, just about what a connected world we do live in. And I know there's lots of discussion about, is that changing? Are we shifting away to more unilateralism versus the very global world that's been growing? But I guess things like the pandemic, things like conflict, the impact of international sanctions, the consequence that I think a really good lesson for businesses to take away is it's a really strong reminder, actually. There's so much dependency within business on those international networks, and I think the companies that have fared really well had been the ones that had a really deep understanding of that, the deep understanding of those second, third order impacts on their supply chain, and a really good understanding of those networks and what they needed to anticipate and prepare for going into times of change and uncertainty and conflict. I think those who had an understanding that was not as deep have felt and had to adjust and pivot around those unintended consequences and those changes in a way where they hadn't had the benefit of being able to prepare for that. So that's certainly something that I've noticed.
Thank you. Yeah, more good advice. Thank you. Another question, I think, Shannon, did you have? Oh, one more? Okay. Any other questions? Please let us know your name as well.
My name's Murray, and I was just interested with what Chris said about at the start of the pandemic, with regarding how you had all these plans for sort of the immediate threats such as fires, terrorism, crashes and things like that. In considering sort of some crises that are more longer term, would you say that moving past COVID, you think it's more important to sort of have the policies and plans for specific events, or sort of practicing the general skills for crisis management, such as effective communication from a board level to frontline and things like that?
Yeah, I think it's a balance. There's no doubt that those things that we have been rehearsing for very regularly reflect very complex events and so many stakeholders, so that we need to run those scenarios to understand. As I said, we've got a state border that runs through the airport, to understand the demarcation for New South Wales and Queensland Police, what AFP's role, the Federal Police's role is, who's going to lead various aspects. And for a lot of those things, from an airport perspective, we get out of the way and let the experts deal with those. But knowing that we have to account for our employees, we have to handle media, we have to deal with the comms, which are things that are probably largely consistent across a range of scenarios. So I think it's important to really work hard on those very, very complex but very real scenarios that can be faced, and then balance that with that flexibility to understand that, okay, we need a framework to make decisions. We need particular roles assigned, and knowing that whatever plan we put in place, something's going to throw it out. We'll say, great, this is the plan. It turns out these two people are on leave, so they're not going to be able to fulfil those roles. Well, what's the backup for those? So I think it's having the flexibility, as we demonstrated through the pandemic. Even the difference with the pandemic has been, in particular, the unknown length of time ahead to deal with it. In some of the scenarios that we train for, you deal with the scenario, you deal with the recovery, you put things in place, and then you get on with things in theory. With the pandemic, we were guessing how long it was going to run for. So all you can do is have a framework that says, okay, this is how we'll deal with our board, our financiers, our shareholders, our employees, the community, media and so on. And I think, as with anything, the key then is to take your learnings from that into modifying your plan and your framework for whatever else is going to come.
Thanks. I think, Richard, you had...
Yeah, could I just jump in?
Yeah.
So is it Murray? Yeah, Murray. So I think what's important to realize is even when you're doing those rehearsals or scenarios, those enabling tasks or those enabling functions that you're talking about, so communications, directions, operations, all the flow-on effects of focusing on a specific scenario are also being rehearsed in practice. So you can pick up, you can just sort of shift your focus around to various areas and have someone look at specifically, how is the communication going here while we're doing this scenario? Is there an answer or is there a solution that we need to be thinking about for longer term communication or whatever that function is that you want to exercise outside of the specifics of that rehearsal. But I think the flow-on effects of having to do that in real life illuminate a lot of things that you don't necessarily recognize ahead of time, and that can bring value to the organization far and beyond a scenario. So whether it's who's going to step into the breach when someone doesn't show on a board panel, or whatever the scenario is. So I think there's more to it than just getting the procedures down. A heck of a lot more.
And wonderful. I mean, you look very young, and I'm really excited about these times are also an opportunity for us all to learn, but particularly our next gens and next generation of leaders. I think it's a wonderful opportunity to be watching and listening to what the leaders are going through now across sectors and absorbing that, because it'll be your turn soon. And the learnings are extraordinary, and particularly in this nation and state, what we deal with in natural disasters, for instance, and how well we've dealt with the pandemic. It's a tremendous resilience that we've built as a society. So we really value all of your insights today. I thought that was a really interesting discussion. Much appreciated the time. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Richard, Chris, Gabby and Jackie. We appreciate it. I think we need a panel photo over there, I've been told afterwards. Thank you, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you.